Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats. If you are in the main hall, can you please either take a seat or can you please kindly continue your conversation elsewhere so that this session can begin. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming. It might seem a little bit odd to have a middle-aged, middle-class white person introducing a speaker on empowering women farmers in Africa. In my defense, I am the product of a fiercely feminist upbringing. My mum was a judge with a sort of strong social justice ethos. But there's another connection, and that's Shume. And there's a group of representatives from Shume at the front, and they're an international organisation with their headquarters in Japan. They have an approach, a sustainable approach to life, which is based on spirituality, and it's based on being in tune with nature through beauty and art, but they have a system of natural agriculture, which is what we're focusing on today. Natural agriculture is based on zero inputs, it's based on seed saving, and there's no rotations, which is sometimes challenging to those of us that have been brought up on the organic principles of rotations, but it's fascinating what they do. I've been lucky enough to visit some of the growers in Japan. If you can't get out to Japan, they do have a site in Wiltshire where it's a demonstration site where they're growing. According to natural agriculture, they have a lot of open days. They've got a conference coming up on the 20th of this month. And if you're lucky, you might get to listen to some of the drumming that they do, which is quite something. So I've known about the work that Shume and Barbara have been doing in Africa for a while, but was lucky enough to meet Barbara last year and hear about it firsthand. And I just thought this is a story that needs to be told. What they're doing there is challenges the narrative that agroecological farming can't feed the world, and it does so in a way that I think sometimes we struggle to do with the food systems we've got in this country. So that's all from me. I'm going to let Barbara tell you her story, and then there'll be time for some questions later. Thank you.
So good morning, real farmers. I didn't hear a good morning. I mean, the sun's out for like an hour. You got to celebrate that. Good morning, real farmers. Happy New Year, by the way. I've noticed every session doesn't actually start with Happy New Year, so Happy New Year to everybody here. So I'm going to tell you my story. It's actually, my name is Barbara Hatshbuka-Banda, and I'm from Zambia. Zambia is in the southern part of Africa. All the way at the bottom, we surround ourselves with people like Botswana, Namibia, and all these other 14 southern African countries. The reason I'm here today to actually speak to you is because I'm going back to the basics of what farming and agriculture is. I'm a third-generation farmer. I actually grew up on a farm riding tractors, horses, you name it. My father is a staunch farmer, an accountant by profession. And in the process of being a young person, I ran away from agriculture. I thought it was very uncool and figured, I'm going to go into journalism. So I'm kind of a private school brat, returned to agriculture because I couldn't run away from the passion of actual agriculture. To be honest, I want to thank Ben Higgins and the Soil Association for actually inviting me here, because I've attended a couple of sessions, and when I think about it, I'm like, Why am I here, to be honest? Because, I mean, England, Europe, the rest of the world is far more advanced than what's happening in Africa. So why possibly would people want to come and hear me speak? Well, I realized the reason I'm here is I'm taking you real farmers back to the basics. Because at the end of the day, before the complications have happened, before all the analysis, the data collection, farming is supposed to be a passion. It's supposed to be the #1 thing people do, not just for poverty reduction, not just for marketing and sales, but at the end of the day, it's a livelihood that changes the world because of various types of farming that exist. So I'm going to tell you about how I got started with Shume International and how it's transformed over 5,000 lives in Africa, in Southern Africa specifically, and how we've expanded the project to various parts of Africa. So one of the things you need to know about Zambia. Zambia is about 752 square kilometers big, so it's slightly bigger than Texas if you want a reference in terms of that. But only 14% of that land is currently being used for agriculture. And only 6% of that land is currently under irrigation. But the funny thing about it is only 19% of agriculture contributes to Zambia's GDP, while over 70% of our population is actually reliant on agriculture. They're small-scale farmers living in rural areas with no income streams of any kind, and their whole focus is agriculture. So the main thing the government actually does is they don't actually put in investment into our agricultural industry. So we have a lot of our population living under $1 a day because of the lack of investment in agriculture specifically. So how did I get started with all this? Basically, while working with the United Nations on the Millennium Development Goals, which now everybody knows as the Sustainable Development Goals, I encountered Shume International in Japan, who actually focused on natural agriculture, a sustainable form of agriculture that doesn't use fertilizer, that doesn't use inputs, that doesn't use hybrid seeds, and focuses on seed saving as the prime part of the agricultural project. So when I met Shume, I said to Shume, I've been working with a couple of small-scale women farmers in Zambia, and I would like to know about your agriculture method. My focus for actually starting this project would be, #1, to reduce poverty in my country. #2, to bring about gender equality. Because the importance with gender equality is, as a woman, and a woman that's grown up in Zambia, I started to realize, and so did my mother, that women don't take part in the development of their countries. They tend to be left behind, even though they're the labor force of the country. So I said, I want to focus on natural agriculture being a positive influence on these women farmers. I also would like to focus on not including inputs and saving seed, because at the end of the day, even if our government is actually investing small amounts in our agriculture industry, they're not investing enough because farmers aren't able to have access to inputs and hybrid seed. So in the process, farmers are being left behind. Farmers that don't have access are not being able to grow food, and there's a lot of suffering and hunger. So in 2004, Shume International actually were brave enough to venture out into Africa, and into Zambia specifically. They came out to Zambia, and they met a couple of the women farmers I was talking about. So we started with 20 small-scale women farmers. And we decided, let's start by putting up demonstration farms that show that the practice of natural agriculture actually works. So we started by looking for indigenous seeds specifically, because one of the laws and the policies that exist in our country is that you cannot save seed. You cannot save hybrid seed, but the policy itself says you cannot save seed as a small-scale farmer. And a lot of farmers don't know this. So a lot of farmers would be like, you know what, I grew up on indigenous seed. There is actually indigenous seeds that actually exist, that aren't patented, that aren't owned. And a lot of these farmers were inheriting these seeds coming down generation from their grandparents. So as part of our work with Shume International, we went out into the rural communities and we started looking for the indigenous seed. And we found 8 different types of indigenous seed, specifically maize, which is our staple food. And what we started doing was we started to purchase or gather these seeds from these farmers and accumulate large quantities of these seeds. And then what we did was we set up 8 demonstration farms in 8 different parts of Babala constituency, which was the area that we started with. When we accumulated these seeds, 8 demonstration farms were set up. The farmers were trained in natural agriculture. Shume came down to Zambia and educated about 8 farmers on how to do natural agriculture. The first year was a bit difficult. The rains were bad. The changing weather patterns were pretty drastic. Zambia had gone through drought for 2 years before that, and this was the 3rd year of drought. So we continued the practice of early planting, natural agriculture was the way to go. We continued to sensitize women within the community, and after like a year, by the 2nd year of planting the indigenous seed, we found ourselves having a good crop of actual natural agriculture maize seed. We then started to continue saving seed and sensitizing more of the women within the community. So a project that started out with 20 small-scale farmers, just growing basic maize, then grew into 100 farmers, then grew into 500 farmers. Then before we knew it, we had 1,200 farmers and a lot of indigenous seed that we had accumulated. Now, our sensitization of the community was focused on, as I've said, the sustainable agriculture as well as the indigenous seed itself. We had to sensitize the community as a whole because we had a lot of naysayers. Oh, this won't work, that won't work. And as you can imagine, it was mostly the men within the community because they didn't want their wives to be part and parcel of a system that, quote unquote, wasn't going to make money for the household. So we had to start looking at the project on a larger scale. So once we started growing more maize and we started growing more maize and we started accumulating the crop, we had to look at creating a value chain system that would be a positive impact for the women farmers. So their husbands would feel like they were part of a system that was actually making money for the community and for their individual households. So we focused on growing the NGO into something that would, be more income generating. So it would be poverty reduction, income generating, and growing the small-scale women farmers to a level where Zambia as a whole and the community would recognize the work that they're doing. Once we finally did this, we found that from 1,000 farmers, a lot more farming communities started to approach our demonstration farms. And while they were approaching our demonstration farms, they wanted to know more about how they could do the practice within their own rural communities. So in 2006, we decided to host our first natural agriculture show, which would showcase the women that started the project, which would then also showcase the projects that had been taking place, which would then also showcase how the project had grown. So we held our first natural agriculture show in Mbabala in 2006. And this was a group of women, basically 500 women farmers who came together, showed their different indigenous seeds that they had collected from various communities and also from the farming practices that they had used. And in the process, it was also a celebration of the culture. So a lot of farmers from various parts of the community started to attend. We also got the support of local leaders, the chiefs, and other parts of the community to be part and parcel of the event. And we found that a 3-day event that was supposed to be for 1,000 farmers, that was scheduled to be for 1,000 farmers, ended up bringing 10,000 farmers from all over the southern part of Zambia. So what was supposed to be a small project with 20 farmers growing ended up in a period of 4 years growing into 5,000 small-scale farmers in 3 different parts of Zambia. And this was all because of the determination of the small-scale farmers themselves. This was all because of the determination of the small-scale farmers themselves. Now, one of the main things that we discovered while we were doing this project is that with small-scale farmers in rural Africa, we found that the major part of making these projects work was that they needed to own the project. It was very simple to have NGOs come into rural communities, educate people about farming, build up the infrastructure, and then people would leave. So projects would only last 1 or 2 years. We wanted this project to last beyond 1 or 2 years. We wanted it to last forever. So we discovered that the only way we could do that is by creating ownership. Small-scale farmers would actually own the project. It would be their project. They would be the project, and they would build it. And that's what would create the sustainability model. So what we did was we actually started to educate the farmers about cooperatives, using the cooperative structure, because the cooperative structure works as a business. Each farmer had to buy shares within this cooperative structure business because they own the business. So therefore, because they own the business, they feel they're part of the success of the business. So what we started to do was when we trained them about natural agriculture, which a lot of you farmers, with natural agriculture, 0 input, 0 pesticides, it makes farming a lot harder. and it reduces the number of yields. But we wanted to focus on, it's not about having millions of tons of yield, but at least having the yield that you require and being part of a value chain system or business to be able to supply those yields to a viable market that would work for you. So hence we created a business model that would be self-sustainable outside the support of our partners, Shume International. So the cooperative structures themselves were there not only to train the farmers, but then also to create a business that would allow them to generate income. So what we would do was each farmer would grow anything between 2 to 10 hectares of maize crop. And in the process after they harvest, they would accumulate these maize crops at a storage shed and warehouse in the center of our training facilities. Once they accumulate and collect this crop, they would then be able, through our cooperatives and the NGO, to actually supply these crops, to actually supply this yield to private sector organizations that were willing to buy them at viable prices. So the model then actually started to generate income, because what we did as an NGO was we actually went out into the private sector community and we started to speak to supermarkets, to lodges, to hotels, and to other milling companies to actually come and have a one-on-one conversation with small-scale farmers who would then be able to sign on contracts and be able to supply to the market that we had signed on to. So the success of the business model, when we started it in about 2008, has actually grown exponentially and is able right now to support 2,000 small-scale farmers within a business, and all of them are growing their crops from natural agriculture. The best part about this model as well is we call natural agriculture, or sustainable agriculture as a lot of people call it, as no-cost agriculture. When you look at the cost of, for a small-scale farmer of buying hybrid seed, of buying fertilizers, of buying pesticides, and with the ever-changing weather patterns and climate, you'll find that in 1 year, what you're assuming the rain pattern will be like changes entirely in a short period of a month. Rain begins in the stipulated time period of November, and by the time we get to somewhere like December, the rain is gone. So all the investment that you made by planting your hybrid seed, by spraying your pesticides, by utilizing your fertilizers, has actually disappeared. The crop itself has died and has no guarantee of growth. But in terms of the sustainable agriculture and natural agriculture, the use of the indigenous seed made it very important to the fact that we had deeper root systems. The indigenous seed itself was adaptable to the changing climate, and our root systems became deeper and more resilient. And we found that farmers who planted the natural agriculture, who planted the indigenous seed, were able to receive yield at the end of whatever the rain season patterns would be. We included early planting training, because we wanted farmers to know that it's not like the olden days where you knew the exact weather pattern, the climate is changing. So if you plant early, you mulch the fields. For us, mulching will cover the fields with dry leaves, dry grass, make sure the surfaces are covered so that the moisture is absorbed within the soil. That way your indigenous seed has more of a chance of surviving. And in this process, with a lot of farmers practicing, we found that farmers were able to actually harvest. And when we put two fields together, your hybrid seed fields and your natural agriculture fields, in a bad weather year, we found that the natural agriculture fields were more successful. And in the process, farmers started to see this. It was a great thing to see, because with farmers, we actually say they actually seeing, in an African context, we actually say seeing is believing. Because when you tell people, it's one thing to tell people, but it's another thing for them to see. And for them, they're actually betting their livelihoods on making sure this actually works. So when we started to show our governments as well that natural agriculture can actually work in this environment, indigenous seed actually works, we were hoping for more support from our governments. We were hoping for more support from NGOs and other sectors that would be able to say, let's expand the training of sustainable agriculture in rural communities. But we found there was a hardship to that as well, because in about 10 years, we had 3 different presidents and 3 new governments. So it was very hard in the process to actually get continuity. Government would support in the first year, and then the government changes a year, 2 years later because we've lost a president or a president has died. And as we know in an African context, when a president leaves, he takes the whole cabinet with him because there are fresh new faces on the floor. So you'd have to start again reintroducing the projects that you're trying to do. So we found that the business model itself made it viable for small-scale farmers. But the question was, how are we going to get the rest of the world to recognize that even in a place like Africa, we are able to reduce poverty as long as we invest in the small-scale farmer themselves, as long as we put power in the seed that we're utilizing. Yes, it seems with a lot of African farmers, the major aspect of it is we want to have more yields. We want to have more food. We want to have more money in our pockets. And the only way we do that for a lot of mindsets is if you invest in fertilizer, if you invest in pesticides, if you invest in hybrid seeds. But we've proven that that's not the case. We want the sustainability model to go much further, to be more scalable, to have more small-scale farmers be able to grow food so that they're able to support their families. So apart from the maize crop, which is rain-fed, we then focused on how do we make sure farmers have money in their pockets, which was also still part of the business model. And since our rain season for us falls from November to March, and it actually is only a 6-month period, we actually focused on creating a value addition chain for vegetables within small-scale rural communities. You can imagine this is a very hard situation in terms of Africa because we lack a lot of water. Some families have to walk at least 5 to 10 kilometers just to be able to get water from the nearest borehole. The river systems tend to dry up after the second month of the rain seasons, so it's a difficult process. But what we started to teach farmers was water harvesting is an important part of vegetable production. And if you can build water harvesting canals by your home with small dams or small streamlines, then you're able to grow your vegetables for a period of 2 to 3 months and then be able to supply those vegetables to supermarkets. So that was another aspect of farming for the small-scale farmers, which they could guarantee would bring income into their homes. So the scalability model focused as well on how we could be part and parcel of the climate change conference. The climate change conferences have been taking place every year in different parts of the world, and what we discovered was that the farmer's voice is not heard. I've attended a few climate change conferences with Shume, and one of the things we've discovered is everybody uses the term climate-smart agriculture. With the terminology of climate-smart agriculture, a lot of our African governments, or just organizations in total, have translated that to use your fertilizers wisely, plant at a certain time, use certain pesticides. They still haven't acknowledged the fact that at least over 70% of the African continent can't actually afford those fertilizers and those pesticides. So one of the reasons we started to attend the climate change conferences is because we felt MDG 1, poverty reduction, MDG 2, MDG 5, gender equality, were important aspects to actually being part, the voice that needed to be part of the climate change conferences. We felt that it was important for the farmer, people like ourselves, to be heard, to tell people that, yes, we're talking about poverty reduction, but how are we doing poverty reduction? We cannot keep pushing agendas like GMOs onto African countries that can't afford it. What are the health factors? What are the health risks? And how do we avoid farmers being trapped in this monetary debt? We listen to countries like India, where a lot of farmers have committed suicide because they're borrowing a lot of inputs from various organizations, and then when their crop fails, they're unable to pay back. That's the same situation in Africa. A lot of farmers are getting more and more into debt, adding the pressure to their households, to their farms, and they're losing the land, the small amount of land they own, or the small amount of property they own, because there is no guarantee to the fertilizers, there is no guarantee to the hybrid seeds, there is no guarantee to the actual farming method. And anyway, they can't afford a lot of these inputs. So for us, it was trying to find the solution to actually address poverty reduction in Africa. And for me, it was when I joined up with Shume International, it was about us creating a network or a partnership that could be utilized across the world, that could be scaled up across the world, so that small-scale farmers in Africa are part and parcel of the conversation of climate change. In this day and age right now, we talk about organic agriculture. Organic agriculture has a bigger market here in Europe. It has a bigger market here in the UK. The reason being, people want to eat healthier. People want to be healthier. But in an African setting, organic agriculture actually doesn't work very well because a lot of people can't afford that type of agriculture. So we're trying to find ways to be able to support farmers through organic, what you call organic agriculture or climate smart agriculture for us, composting and different methods, so that farmers are part and parcel and able to grow food for themselves. So for me right now, we're hoping that you farmers as well would be part and parcel of the climate change solution. We're hoping that you organic farmers here in the UK, as part of soil being the answer to carbon sequestration, we're hoping that you'll be part of joining a movement like the one we've done, where you're able to have more people do organic agriculture so that it's better for the environment. Right now, Shume International is not only in Zambia, we've scaled up to the Gambia as well, where we've got small-scale farmers there doing climate-smart agriculture. We've also got a school in Tanzania, where it's a student school with about 200 young girls. They're actually doing natural agriculture there as well, and being able to grow food for the boarding school itself, and support the boarding school itself through the agriculture they're doing. We're also in Malawi, where we're supporting small-scale youth farmers to become better at, we're supporting small-scale youth farmers so that they're able to do farming. Because at the end of the day, for a lot of us African young people, a lot of people don't feel like agriculture is a cool career. But in an African context, we're trying to reduce rural-urban migration by promoting agriculture as being a viable career for young people to follow in. So in Malawi, we're supporting young farmers to make sure that a lot of other young farmers join in and see agriculture as a viable career. Other than that, Ben, I'd like to say thank you. I'd like to also just say thank you to all of you for coming, but I guess this was just a reintroduction of back to the basics, giving you people here in the UK an opportunity to see that even people like Africa are part and parcel of the fight, and we hope that you will join us in that.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Well-deserved long clap there. I think it shows how inspiring it is. I was struck actually by, although the context is very different, actually how similar some of the challenges are. You know, it's around resilience of farming, it's finding markets. You know, it's even agriculture not being a cool career, you know, which is an issue we have in this country. So the similarities are almost as interesting. Anyway, we've got lots of time for questions. So, yeah. Should we start, and then one on the other side?
Tim Roberts, Tropical Agriculture Association. I've had the privilege of working overseas in East and Southern Africa most of my working life, mainly Kenya, Tanzania, and Malawi, but I did get one trip into Zambia. I noticed I was working near the copper belt for an NGO, and the people, once the copper fell apart, the people who were living in the towns there did not know how to go back and work on their farms, which is a problem we have in this country, of course. Yeah. So that's one question I have, are you working there? Second one is, have Shume considered drought-tolerant crops as an alternative to maize, for example, sorghum and millet? Thank you.
Do you want to take another one, or should I answer that?
Answer that, that's fine, yeah.
Okay, so one of our major plans is to actually go into the copper belt, but we haven't gone into the copper belt because, as you've said, there are not so many small-scale farmers within the copper belt system that are very much interested. And if they are, because the copper belt is the copper industry area, a lot of farmers there are focused on, we're trying to be business people, supplying the mines with different things. So we're also trying to work on changing the mindset, because we prefer to go into communities where we're invited, because that's what makes the model sustainable. If you force yourself into a community, you find they accept you for that moment in time. Then when you leave like a year later or so, then they don't continue. So we hope that, you know, with the help of government, we hope we have a sustainable government for the next few years, we can actually get the information out there and then have communities from there invite us so that we're able to expand the projects to them. In terms of the different crops, we do crop rotations, and we actually have a variety of crops. So maize being one of them, groundnuts, peanuts for everyone who doesn't know what groundnuts is. Peanuts is another. Cassava is also one of them. Millet and sorghum grow specifically in areas like the northern part of Zambia. So we haven't actually done millet and sorghum in the southern part per se. Yes, and then in the western part we do rice as well. So we have looked at we are currently using different crops, and one of the major aspects to that question is that with natural agriculture for Shume International in Japan, they do monoculture because they don't have pest problems. So we had to readapt our model to fit the Zambian environment. So for us, we have a major issue with pest attack. So what we started to do was to actually change our crops so that we're able to combat pests as one of the solution to our pest attacks.
Thank you. Yeah, on the other side.
Hi, Barbara. Callum Weir. I'm really impressed with the pace of change that you were able to achieve to get 5,000 farmers to change in 3 or 4 years. Why do you think that was? Was it that the situation was so bad before that they were able to get into regenerative agriculture?
I think there's been a lot of desperation. Especially, you know, I like the way World Bank and a lot of other organizations on any report that you see in the news give big GDP amounts. So, you know, Zambia currently is at $1,589 GDP. But it actually is not the case in a rural setting, in a rural community. I mean, those calculations are done based on the copper prices of that year. They're not actually done based on the income of individual households. So a lot of the expansion that has taken place is definitely through desperation. Farmers are looking for a way to support their families, to feed their families. And if anyone who's a parent can understand that, not even just a parent, a basic human being who needs basic things, anyone can understand that. And one of the major programs our government went into was called the FSP, the Fertilizer Support Program. Now, the Fertilizer Support Program basically would subsidize fertilizer packs. So for like a 20 kg bag of hybrid seed, with 8 bags of fertilizer, your 4 bags are of D and your 4 bags are of urea, farmers would actually have to pay something like $20 membership allowance. And a lot of farmers wouldn't have that $20 in order to be able to access that fertilizer at the $10 price that government was subsidizing it for. And then what did happen was even farmers that were able to afford those memberships weren't receiving their hybrid seeds and the fertilizer within the stipulated rain period because of the corrupt system of a lot of the fertilizer and a lot of the hybrid seed going missing. So the system is drastically flawed, and a lot of farmers have become desperate in the process. And I think in that desperation and within the sensitization and working within the communities and the fact that they own it, they found a solution to actually solving their problem. You still get within the 5,000 farmers some of, you know, 1 or 2 small scale, what we call small scale commercial farmers who are still, you know, they're quite confident to still go out and get hybrid seed and fertilizer, or they feel more comfortable that they're doing both types of agriculture. This climate smart agriculture is to feed my family, specifically for food in my home, while this fertilizer agriculture is for the money-making process so that I'm able to send my kids to school. But even in the process, they've been able to see that, you know, climate smart agriculture is actually the best way to go, because they've had years when they've spent the money and then nothing's come of it, or the quantity that's come out of it after spending the amount of money they have has ended up being a waste of time.
Yeah, sorry, the chap in the blue, sorry, the lady chap, kind of behind the number person, there we go, yeah, in the blue, and then you afterwards, sorry. Yeah, you're both in blue.
To what extent has this kind of had larger impacts on the wider community, so social and the kind of,
okay. Yeah. So basically, the Natural Agriculture Show itself is our major event and our measure of what impact it has on the community. So when we first started out, especially when we finally got to about 1,300 farmers, we actually conducted a data survey to see how many people within the community were impacting. Because in an African context, to educate a woman is to educate the community. That's what we believe, because women have, access to everyone. And we're just pushy like that. So one of the things we did a data collection survey, and we discovered that out of 1,300 farmers that we were working with, these total farmers had 10,000 children that we were directly impacting. So these were either children born to the household or dependents. So in an African context, when a family member dies, you take on your sister's children or so on and so forth. So within that context of that community, so it was 1,300 farmers, we directly impacted 10,000 children, specifically from ages 0 all the way up to 15. We then also realized that average household in an African context is anything between 5 family members to 10 family members. And when we started doing the Natural Agriculture Show itself, when we started inviting the community to be part and parcel so that they could see what members of their own community were doing, visually, have an actual visualization of, here are my tomatoes, they're so much larger, they're so much better, they're so much tastier. It would be a direct interaction between farmers. How did you do that? How did you manage to do that while your neighbor 2 doors down, who hasn't been doing what you're doing, has failed tomatoes? So it was a direct education, it was train the trainer. The farmers themselves were training each other. And in the process, during these shows that we do once a year annually, we actually find that we have at least 10,000 plus community people that actually attend the show. So we're impacting a larger part of the community. But the only problem we have is we need the support of government to be able to reach every single household so that we're able to sensitize and educate a lot more farmers so that they take part and parcel. Right now, our project is still, for us, we feel 5,000 is large scale. But to be honest, we want to get much larger. So we're hoping that we'll be able to impact a lot more with the support of our government.
Great. So
I was really aware in your talk that there was this very beautiful and succinct and successful overstory of this work that you're doing with Shume. And I feel like there's an understory as well that I'd love to hear a bit more about. And it's about, I guess the way I want to say it is, I really feel that there's a song that women farmers can sing for the earth at this point in time. And part of the overstory success that I hear is that they are women farmers.
Yes.
Not that they're farmers without gender, that they are women farmers. And that feels so important to me and to what I feel a song is and the song that can be sung. And I would love to hear a bit more about that, because for me, this song is about deep connection to the earth. It's about reclaiming that connection, but also the pragmatic day-to-day of getting food in the household, growing good food, growing indigenous seed. There's pragmatism, but there's also connection. Yeah. And I think it's something about that song of women. So I would love you to speak a little bit more about that, if that's okay.
I'm going to do this just for you. Mother Africa, her rivers flowing, Stimbella, Stimbella. Mother Africa, her rivers flowing, Stimbella, Stimbella, doom. So that one's just for you. So the deep connection, and I'm happy you asked about this. So I told you I'm a private school brat. I actually grew up on a farm with my father because my father is a farmer. Accountant by profession, but farmer by, by passion. So every weekends was spent either riding tractors or my father making us run around after the cattle to make sure they go into the cattle crawl or something funny like that. Living on a farm with no electricity, water pump, you know, just the basics, sitting around firewood. And then my father went into politics and became a member of parliament. And in the process of him being a member of parliament, this is one of the areas that we actually started the project in. And the reason for it was, in the process of when my father became a member of parliament in this area, my mother would always be there by his side, being part of this community. And she was one of the people who identified the lack of participation that women had in terms of the development of their households, in terms of, you know, just the development of their country. Because in an African context, the man owns the land, the women and the children work the land. So, you know, she wanted them to have more. To have a decision at the table, even in a household context. So she actually was the first person to start sensitizing these women about, you know, about cooperatives and how they could work, and, you know, how, you know, as a women's group, they could build this project to the next level. So she sensitized the community, and that's how we started with, you know, she started with the first 20 women. And in the process, at this point in time, I'm, you know, studying to be a journalist. I've graduated, and I'm working with the UN and doing other things. And my mom would be like, "Oh, come on, you've got to help me out." And I'm like, "Oh, I'm too busy. You know, party life is good in the city. Who wants to be part of the rural area?" So that was the first part of it. And then my mother passed away in a car accident 2 months after being able to register this women's group. And all these women attended her funeral. It was such a big thing. And then, you know, we had to take the funeral to this rural community because my mother was ever beloved by these women. And all these women kept saying, "Oh, you've got to help us out. You've got to, you know, you're your mother's daughter. So you've got to be part and parcel of trying to change a community of women. Come on, do something about it." At first I was like, so not happening. So don't want to go back to farming or the rural area. And then a year later, I meet Shume International. And I'm like, "Oh, Lord, this is like that voice that keeps ringing in the back of my head, leading me back to, you know, these women and my mother's dream." And so when I met Shume, and by that time I had attended so many conferences and, you know, been part of so many speeches. And in the process, when I met Shume, it was like a light in my head saying, "You're so in the wrong place. You know, great you're working with young people and HIV and AIDS, but I need you back in gumboots and in the farm." So when I invited Shume, to be honest, I kind of approached Shume and I said, "Shume, would you guys like to come to Zambia?" And they're like, this was September, and they're like, "Great, we can be there by November." I'm like, damn, they actually agreed to the invitation. And so, you know, they come down and they're like, "We're here for 5 days. What do you want us to see?" And I said, "Well, it's not what I want you to see. There's a group of women in a rural community. I'm basically just doing the introduction for you. Why don't we drive out there, you meet these women." And they met these women, and the energy that existed and the passion that existed for these women farmers. They wanted to know about natural agriculture. They were like, "We've been doing this. We did it with Barbara's mother, and we want to continue doing it. And she says you can help us." And they were like, "We can not only help you, you can help us because you can spread our natural agriculture practice." So, you know, there was just that synergy, that moment where farmers from across the world have met each other and like, you know, we're doing something similar, but, you know, the miles in between and ocean didn't seem to make a difference. So a week later, I was like, you know, I need to be fully invested in this. And Shume was like, "We're so not wasting time." And the women in Babala were on the phone constantly, were driving up to my house, and my house was always full with people. So, you know, the transformation that existed in that moment, you know, where you see a group of people who are so passionate about something, who say to themselves, "We've got nothing, but we're willing to take the chance." And they're telling Shume, "We're willing to take the chance on you." And they're looking at me and they're saying, "You know what, we've known your mother for a long time, and you can't be bad because your mother was good. So if we knew your mother that well, we know you're going to take us to the next level." So when the project continued to grow and people were inviting, you know, would invite us, like after a show, would invite us to another rural community, and you get there and there's 200 women sitting there, I'm like, ooh, I'm scared. I'm frightened because this project is growing faster than I actually realized it would grow. But you'd get there and these women are singing and dancing and, you know, doing everything, and they're saying, we're here, we're ready, we've seen what you've done in this community. Now we want to do the hard work, put in the hard work and be part and parcel. It's a glorious thing to see. And one of the, I guess the hardships behind it, like I've said, is in the last 10 years, we've had 3 different governments. We've had 2 presidents die and the government shift. So one minute when you feel that you're making the progress to be able to expand this to other farmers and go from 5,000 to almost 1 million farmers, it goes in reverse because there's a government shift. So every day, and Shume has been there throughout the time, and you ask, you know, you speak to Shume and they're like, we're here with you because this has to be owned by the community. The community has to be part and parcel of this. We see the progress, we see that it can work, but the hardships is actually trying to get our own government to recognize it. But within the rural communities, it's seeing that drive, it's seeing that passion, it's listening to that song that makes it worthwhile.
Great, there were a couple of questions at the front and then the gentleman on the right. You had your hands up earlier? Yeah.
I'm from a farm in the north of England, and my grandfather died this year. He was 101, and the whole issue of land ownership became really interesting to me about who inherits farms once the patriarch dies. It's very traditional. Here, the men inherit the farms. And I wondered what change you could see in your situation for sons and daughters in farming families in that regard.
So in terms of a lot of African countries, I know a lot of women aren't allowed or able to own land. In a Zambian context, it's slightly different. So your household would be, you've got the land, especially in a rural community, you've got your husband and you own the land. He determines what you grow on the land in terms of the land itself. And then you live with all your children basically on the farm. So each child, if they get married, ends up building their own hut or household there. So it becomes like an extended family living on one property. In terms of when the owner of the land, the father, dies, it's simply passed down to his children. So if you have sons, but yet the mother kind of manages it. So then she becomes the matriarch of the family and looks after and decides what's going to happen to the property. It's very rare in an African context that land would be taken away. What's actually happening in this modern age now is there are lots of small-scale farmers, because land by custom is given to you by your headman or your chief, signed off by your chief. So you own that land even if you don't have a title deed to it. You're in a community book with your family name in there, and it's passed down within your family. And what's ending up happening now is we found that a lot of small-scale farmers are selling their land. And they're selling their land to people who are coming from the city who want to create a farm, you know, and a lot of these people buy the land, but the farm is not actually being utilized. So in the rural context in terms of Zambia, it's not that the land is actually taken away, it actually remains within the family. But the only problem we found with that was, so the husband would decide how your farming system goes, the women and children are the labor force, so when he dies, you find there's a loss of knowledge somewhere there. There's a loss of leadership. So your women fail to take over the actual farming and the business, how it carries, for it to carry on to the same level the husband did it with. So the same way the husband did it. So our project as well, because we're working with small-scale women farmers specifically, it's to educate them and give them the confidence to be small-scale farmers of their own. So in a lot of cases where we were getting a negative from the husbands because it was not financially viable for them, and now that they've seen the project develop over the last couple of years and they've seen the business model that's included in that, a lot of husbands have now wanted to join the project, but we have a rule that you can only have 20% men, otherwise they take over the entire project. So, we have a cap on that. So a lot of husbands have wanted to join, but we simply say, your wife is your representative. She's now your family representative. So if you have 10 hectares of land, why don't you separate this land, you know, because they have pretty large areas of land. If you have 10 hectares of land, why don't you give her 2 hectares to do climate-smart agriculture while you do the remaining 8 hectares with whatever it is you want to do with it? So a lot of husbands have been responsive like that, and they've, you know, been able to say, my wife is doing her climate-smart agriculture this side, and that's working for the household, while we're trying to do other things, maybe cotton or other things on the other side of the land. So the land issue it's progressive. Yeah.
So there was, the one more lady in the middle, and then the gentleman on the side.
Hi, I just wonder if you use neem or grow neem in Zambia.
What's that?
Neem. Neem, I discovered neem first. I have an allotment in North London, along with 200 other allotments. And there was one woman there who never got blackfly on her broad beans. And I said, why? Everybody else has got blackfly this year. She said, I spray it with neem. Neem is a tree that grows wild in India.
Oh, wow.
And everything you can use on the neem tree. It's an antibacterial, antifungal. It's an insect repellent. Okay. And in one part of Africa where they've used it as a spray, they've actually got rid of the mosquito that carries malaria, and they've reduced malaria. But in this country, there's one man, Dr. Mystery, in in Hampstead in London, an Indian guy who's lived here for years, who's imported the bark to Luton and he's ground it down. And there are some organic farmers do buy the neem from him. I buy neem powder from him and sell it on my allotments. And when I also go out and work in Uganda once a year, and I talk to people there, farmers there, about neem. And I Googled it, and I saw that the Ugandan government had said that in the Kigezi area of Uganda, they should plant so many 100 neem trees. Nobody's ever got round to doing it. But there are parts of Africa where they do grow it. I'm surprised that you haven't heard of it. I think everybody should look up neem, N-E-E-M.
N-E-E-M. I'll definitely take a look at that because, that's pretty important. With us, there's a tree called the Musekese tree, specifically indigenous to Zambia. So I guess in an African context, different trees are indigenous to different areas. And one of the things the farmers have found is that with the Musekese tree, they actually soak it in water and they grow it around their fields, and they actually spray vegetables sometimes or they water the vegetables with the soaked water, not actually spray it. They water the vegetables, and they found that there's less pests and insect attack on certain vegetables. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Conservation Farming Trust. My name's Skinner. I'm interested to know a bit more about natural agriculture, because you focus very much on cereals, on maize, and there's more to life than kosher. So I was wondering about nature is all about diversity, and organic farming, which you say is too expensive for Zambia. Yeah. The whole point about it is that organic is highly diversified, and I wondered to what extent natural agriculture includes symbiotic combinations of plants and animals and horticulture in a mixed farming context.
Okay. So with natural agriculture, before I actually answer that question, if you're interested in learning more about natural agriculture, Shume International has a farm in Yatesbury, which I think, Ben, you mentioned as well.
Yeah, and Shinya is the grower there, so do grab him.
So they have taught us all about the methodology, and basically with natural agriculture in an African context. So we've had to readjust it, but not so much, but keep the primary principles and focus of natural agriculture. The 3 aspects for us has been seed saving. Utilization of indigenous seeds to develop, which help develop deeper root systems. The second aspect is mulching. You don't actually use compost or manures or anything. You don't add anything. You actually basically use a mulching system, which is dry leaves and grass covering the surface, your topsoil, protecting your soil specifically from erosion and runoff, wind erosion, water erosion, that sort of thing. And the third aspect for us, which we added in, was the early planting aspect. But the whole symbiosis of natural agriculture to the environment is that you don't add anything. If you look at most trees and most environments, they're very natural. They don't need fertilizer additions. They don't need anything added to them. And that's why we call it, for us in Africa, we call it no-cost agriculture. That apart from your regular weeding and things like that, there's actually very little you need to add into it. Yes, we do, a lot of farmers, we do teach farmers as well how to make compost, but not how to utilize it immediately. So we reduce the amount of manures that they actually put into their systems, because we discovered, especially in vegetable gardens, they have high pest attacks. But in terms of natural agriculture, the deeper principle, I think Alice and the rest would be the best to answer it. But in an African context, that's how we adapted it. And we found that, one of the major things was the farmers responded very well to it, because it was their form of agriculture from their ancestors before the 50s came in and companies started to bring in fertilizers and other things. So with African farmers, they had already been using this type of agriculture. They had already been using organic, they had already been using natural agriculture, where you add very little. For them, they called it conservation agriculture. And it's worked for them, and that's why, also I think to the question, why has it been so successful? It's already a form of agriculture they knew how to use.
Great. There was one more question, and so we'll take two very quick questions, and then we'll have to, so at the front and then the back. Thank you.
My question's about feminism, and you seem to be someone who plays an incredible bridge between on-the-ground indigenous agriculture and the UN and the Millennium Development Goals, yes, and a more kind of global picture of change in social justice.
Yes.
And considering like the colonial history of Southern Africa, and I wonder how you're running an inherently feminist project, right? I think we probably all agree. But like, do you ever talk about feminism? How does that kind of terminology, that kind of language ground with the women that you're working with?
I think, to be honest, I'm a practicing feminist. I walk it, I talk it, I am it. In terms of just the project itself, to be honest, I haven't focused on feminism so much. I think I focused more on actually the success of the project, getting these women farmers to be economically viable. That has been the major aspect. And then I focused on being a voice in the climate change race, in the climate change fight, because in as much as we're a small part of the world, I feel like what we're doing is a major part of actually solving something that's about to happen 20, 30 years from now. I think a lot of people, in terms of the climate change conferences and other things, they look at the world as being, oh, these problems are only going to happen 20, 30 years from now. But I feel like yesterday we were in 2017. And then today we're in 2019. Time is flying. And you can actually, one of the reasons for me doing this project is because you can see the impact it's actually already causing on the ground, especially in African countries. It's visible, the changing weather conditions, the climate conditions. It's very visible. In African countries like Lesotho, you're talking it's snowing now. You're like, wow, why is it snowing in winter in Lesotho? You're in the middle of Africa. It shouldn't be happening. So you can actually see the problems. And I think I focus on the fact that I'm a mother. I want to be part of the voices to change the future. So in terms of the women themselves, how do I focus on feminism? I think we focus on being the change. We focus on sending the message out there that as women, we are part and parcel. We are part and parcel of the change. We are the change. So, yeah, that's my answer to that. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Barbara. I think we've run out of time. Really, really fantastic session, really inspiring. Thank you for some great questions as well from the audience. But one final round of applause.
Thank you very much.